Hello and welcome to Radical Engagement. And I'm going to cross streams a little bit today. We're going to talk about Byung-Chul Han psychopolitics, but you're going to find that this chapter, which is entitled Friendly Big Brother, is going to rhyme with a lot of the stuff we talked about with Baudrillard. This is from the, let me see, when is this dated? So it's published in 2017. I'm guessing there is no information about when the German was published immediately available. This is a translation by Eric Butler. And this is Psychopolitics. We're going to talk about Chapter 8, Friendly Big Brother. I'm going to read reading now. Newspeak is a name for the ideal language in George Orwell's surveillance state. It is meant to supplant old speak entirely. Newspeak only has one goal, to restrict room for thinking freely. Every year, words decrease in number, and the space for conscious thought diminishes. Syme, a friend of 1984's hero Winston, waves about the beauty of destroying words. Thought crimes, he enthuses, will be made impossible when the words necessary for them are struck from the lexicon. In this process, the notion of freedom will be abolished too. On this score, Orwell's surveillance state differs fundamentally from the world of the digital panopticon, which uses freedom to excess. Today's society of information is not characterized by destroying words, but by multiplying them without end. I find this interesting as an observation that we have a fundamental technology similar to what's described in 1984, but it's used in an entirely different way, even if the changes to the language are one of the effects. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this for a bit. I've done a lot of research on Orwell, and I, like any Marxist, don't have simple feelings about him. But one of the things I will tell you that I've always disagreed with Orwell is in his later works, he's highly influenced by what would become the Sapir-Whorf theory of language and cognition, which is that language, particularly the lexicon and variety of expression, actually limits thought, and in a direct way. So you have a cultural limitation upon thought. Sapir-Whorfism, while some elements of it have been repopularized in the last decade, the general thesis that just because you don't have a word structure for something doesn't that you can't experience it or even begin to express it is just false. So I'm already a little taken aback by this very evocative literary reference that Byung-Chul Han is using. A very English one, even though he's writing in German. But I'm like, well, you posited a binary where the binary imaginary of, the literary thing you're bringing up is false. Or at least it's too simple. So I'm not know if I'm supposed to take something different from the fundamental way that power works, or if our understanding of power is different. And I suppose those are related, but not quite the same. Back to the text. The spirit of the Cold War and the negativity of enmity dominate Orwell's novel. The country it describes is in a state of permanent war. Julia, Winston's love interest, speculates about bombs raining down on London every day having been launched by Big Brother and the party in order to maintain fear and terror in the populace. The enemy of the people, called Emmanuel Goldstein, he commands a network of underground conspirators seeking to overthrow the government. Big Brother is at ideological war with Goldstein. The 2 Minutes Hate, the broadcast daily on the telescreen, takes aim at Goldstein, and the Ministry of Truth, in fact, a ministry of lies, the past is revised and fitted to ideology. Orwell's surveillance state employs the psychotechnical methods of brainwashing, electroshock, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, drugs, and physical torture. The Ministry of Plenty, Newspeak Mini Plenty, seeks to it that consumer goods are always lacking, so an artificial state of need may be maintained. Orwell's surveillance state with its telescreens and its torture chambers is fundamentally different from the day's digital panopticon with its internet, smartphones, and Google Glass. In the digital panopticon, the illusion of limitless freedom and communication predominates. There is no torture, just treat and post. Nor is there mysterious ministry of truth. Transparency and information have taken the place of truth. The new concept of power does not involve controlling the past, but steering the future psychopolitically. We can hear a lot of Baudrillard in that paragraph. And I think it's interesting because I think the insight's actually somewhat fair. We don't need to limit information, although it is becoming limited by commodification, but not by outright suppression in most cases. However, it wasn't that long ago, less than 15 years ago, when we knew about open torture sites in the War on Terror. So, are we actually in an opposite world from 1984? Itself an imaginary one. You know, we're positing a real world against an imaginary one. But are we actually positing a real world? Or we're just positing part of it. There's a tendency in European theory to like use parallelisms a lot to make a point. This is a rhetorical strategy, and it's fine as rhetoric, but it's not so great as analysis. Anyway, back here. The neoliberal technology of power does not prohibit, protect, or oppress. Okay, asterisk. I really love Byung-Chul Han's work, but this is a issue I've had with leftists for about 20 years. They are unable to distinguish when we are talking about neoliberalism or capitalism or the state and capitalism or rentier technologies. Neoliberalism is a way of organizing capitalism, and so I guess we could call the current technology state neoliberal because it's created on artificial markets through rentier means, which I guess would justify what Byung-Chul Han is saying, but I'm having to do the work for him. Anyway, it's not so much I think it's wrong, it's just the word is evoked without really nailing down its referent. Consumption is not held in check but maximized. See, consumption is not held in check but maximized is actually something we relate to capital itself. That's not just neoliberalism. But anyway, no production of scarcity occurs. Indeed, surplus is generated. Indeed, a superabundance of positivity. Everyone is encouraged to communicate and consume. This is all true. The principle of negativity, which still defined Orwell's state, has not yet yielded to the principle of positivity. I'm always struck when you're comparing, this is me talking, when you're comparing something fictional to something real. Are we supposed to take that there was a movement from the fictional description, which was a world that didn't quite exist, to a movement to the current, which does exist? So there's a movement from the imaginary of the past to the understanding of the current. Is that a valid way to argue? Again, effective rhetoric, but analysis, I don't know. Let's continue. I will say, I do love Byung-Chul Han's prose, at least as it's translated by Eric Butler, and the other books I've read, even when they have different translators, have been pretty enjoyable. And I'm not disagreeing here. I just want to complicate this argument. There's a lot of things hidden in it we should tease apart. Needs are not repressed, but simulated. Confession obtained by force has been replaced by voluntary disclosure. Smartphones have been substituted for torture chambers. See, that's where there's a lot. The first statement there, confession obtained by force has been replaced by voluntary disclosure. Totally true. Smartphones have been substituted for torture chambers. That depends on who you are. Still torture chambers in the world. Big Brother now was his friendly face. His friendliness is what makes surveillance so efficient. I think that's true. So we have to just parse here. I'm being nitpicky and maybe pedantic, but I think it is important to think about how Why would the things he's describing as no longer needed still exist in the world at current? What would cause them to exist? What is this leaving out? What's the excluded middle? Or the excluded other? Bentham's big brother was invisible, but he was everywhere in the prisoners' minds. Inmates interiorized him. In contrast, the inhabitants of today's digital panopticon never feel like they are being watched or threatened. I don't say never, but generally I'd agree with this. Consequently, the surveillance state is an imprecise name for describing the digital panopticon. Here, everyone feels free. However, precisely this feeling of freedom, which is nowhere to be found in Orwell's state, is now the problem. The digital panopticon thrives on its occupants' voluntary self-exposure and self-illumination, following the same logic. In either case, freedom is exploited. The digital panopticon likes the big brother wresting information from us against our will. Instead, we lay ourselves bare voluntarily. The advertisement that Apple aired during 1984 Super Bowl has become the stuff of legend. In it, the company presented itself as a force of liberation, which would counter the Orwellian surveillance state. Now we get why we're comparing the fictional to the real through an understanding of the fictional in the real world of the past. Those movements are fun. In lockstep, listless workers, evidently without a will of their own, march into a vast hall and listen to Big Brother's fanatical declamations on the telescreen. Then the ad shows a woman rushing into the assembly hall, the thought police in hot pursuit. Bearing a sledgehammer before her heaving breast, she dashes forward, full of resolve. She went straight to Big Brother and throws the sledgehammer at the telescreen with the force she can muster. It explodes in a dazzling burst of light. The assembled workers promptly awaken from their torpor. A voice declares, on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. But despite Apple's message, 1984 did not signal the end of the surveillance state so much as the inception of a new kind of control society, one whose operations surpass the Orwellian state by leaps and bounds. Now communication and control have become one without remainder. Now everyone is his or her own panopticon. It is the self-enforcement of this insight that I think Byung-Chul Han has. We also saw kind of hint in some of the late work Baudrillard and the Agony of Power. For all my problems with that book, I think that insight's actually correct. That we are participating in this. I once joked about 6 years ago on Facebook that now most of the Stasi would be unemployed because we give all the information that they employed people to collect for free. Yes, it is invasive. And yes, sometimes that invasiveness does intrude upon you, like when I get an ad for something that I mentioned out loud, but never searched. You're reminded that these little boxes are always on, always watching. The funny thing about neoliberalism, though, and this may be where Byung-Chul Han is actually correct, and we're going to go back and forth between his disappearance of ritual and psychopolitics for a while. So I think having him comment on the present will make clear what he's talking about in doing a genealogy of the recent past. But let's ask ourselves, the irony of neoliberalism is it convinces you you're in an entrepreneurial society that requires the state to constantly intervene to create markets where there aren't any and they don't normally work. The state has not shrunk under neoliberalism, it's expanded. It just employs less people directly and employs more people indirectly. Actually, I'm not even sure it employs less people directly. After all, in a lot of areas, the major employers are the school system, then often military Keynesian policies and stuff that serves that, etc. Although the Keynesianism in the military has been drying up for 2 decades now too. It was a condition of my childhood during the first part of neoliberalism, when it was ascendant from the 80s to the 90s, that the places that were left out were often included with military bases, which kept their economy at bay. Part of the shrinking of the small town America is actually tied into that. As a lot of these mid-sized towns and post-industrial towns were held up by their proximity to military bases, particularly in the South and the West. But that has gone away. Yes, the military bases are still there, but increasingly the money is not. One of the ironies, as I've said before, is the Iraq War really neoliberalized the one part of the state that was not neoliberalized. And student loans help neoliberalize the other. Education. So, just one of the perversities of the past, just we look at this from a cultural lens, epiphenomenal or not, is that we've been participating in these mass public networks. There are other options. The old internet still exists in the current one, but they become less and less attractive because fewer and fewer people use them. And as fewer and fewer people use them, their ability to have use goes away while you get in these commodified gardens. The old gardens still exist. Live journals, although it's commodified and owned by a Russian company, but live journals still exist. And it was commodified from the first place. You could go to an old chat room, etc. Although increasingly, copyright law and rentier law in the United States has even taken away that. See what has happened with the Internet Archive. No, we have to ask ourselves, how has the current society appeared to us as the opposite of what it is for a long time? The most equal society producing the most inequality ever. Unfreedom everywhere, even by Pew law. An ownership society where you own less and less of the functions of the machines you even have access to. All these things happen. This is even of the small flaws I may have pointed out in Byung-Chul Han's work, and of the larger ones I pointed out in Baudrillard. We see that there really is a there, even if it's, in Baudrillard's case, often encapsulated in gnomic pronouncements that could be read multiple ways. There's an ecstasy in theory we have to be wary of, but I do think Byung-Chul Han walks the line. Ultimately, despite my problems with the rhetorical structure of that little mini essay in Psychopolitics, I ultimately think he gets to a truth, and a very good one. Something we should think about, as neoliberalism itself seems to be decoupling. And there's now pushback on who gets to participate in this excess of freely given surveillance. If you don't think it's relevant to the scandals around TikTok, think again. And with that, good night.